Welcome back to the daily Rambam class. We are up to chapter 2 of Shar Avis Hatubah, other principal forms of impurity. It is Thursday. Let us start with a brief recap of where we are up to in the Rambam. We are learning the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, and as we have been for a long time, we're in the 10th volume, Sefer Torah, the Book of Purity, which has smacking 144 chapters, 8 subjects. The 8 subjects are Tumas Meis, impurity of the dead. We spent about a month on that, 25 chapters. The red heifer, about 2 weeks on that. Soras, about 2 weeks on that. Mishkav Aboisham, impurity to the places one lies or sits on. We spent about 2 weeks on that. And now we are on to Sha'ar Avos HaTumos. As of yesterday, we began to learn of other sources of Tumah, other sources of impurity. We'll have 20 chapters designated to that. And then we'll learn more about foods, vessels, and finally the laws of mikveh. Let's take a look at Sha'ar Avos HaTumos. So what are the other sources of Tumah that the Rambam groups together under a single topic? It's interesting because sometimes the Rambam will have even as little as 3 chapters for a particular topic, but here the Rambam decides to group these. Here we are. These 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 categories into one topic. So these categories over here are not in the Rambam. It's in the publication that I'm using over here. This Rambam in hand. This Shar Avis HaTumah is other sources of Tumah. The Rambam is going to look at all of these different sources of impurity over 20 chapters. And it's interesting that he doesn't put them into individual subjects. Maybe it's because the Rambam wanted specifically a total of 83 subjects. There are 83 topics in the Rambam. So I'm not sure why, but there are probably many reasons for it. But these are other 4 sources of impurity. Let's take a look at today's chapter, which is the laws of Sha'ar Avos HaTumos, chapter 2. As we see yesterday, we began to learn about an animal carcass, how a dead animal imparts impurity. Let's learn more about that today. So in a non-kosher animal, whether it's a behemoth or a chaya, whether it's domesticated or it's wild, if it was shechted, if a person decided to take a pig and shecht it, so obviously it's not kosher. But in the context, there's when we talk about kosher, not kosher, there's what's most relevant is whether we can eat it. But what's also relevant is whether it imparts impurity, whether it would cause a person to become tamei, impure, and would no longer able to enter into the Beis HaMikdash or to partake of an offering, like we just had the Paschal offering. Soon we'll have Pesach Sheni. What happened for Pesach Sheni? There were many Jews that had been impure, and since they were impure, they weren't able to partake of the Paschal offering. So they came into Moses and they said, we also want to have a chance. And so he introduced a holiday a month later called Pesach 2, Pesach version 2, for those that weren't able to make Pesach 1, for those that were impure. But what was the cause for this? It was because they were impure. Since they were impure, they were not allowed to partake of the Paschal offering. And so Moshe gave them another chance. So when we talk about kosher, not kosher animals, there's as far as whether we're allowed to eat them, and then there's as far as whether they impart impurity. So we learned that a kosher animal, the moment that it's shechted, loses its ability to impart impurity as a source of impurity. As long as the animal is alive, it's pure. And then once the animal dies, if it wasn't shechted, it would be able to cause a person to become tamei and no longer able to participate in bringing and eating the Paschal offering or any other offerings for that matter. But once the kosher animal was shechted, the moment it's shechted, it loses its ability to become impure. With a non-kosher animal, shechting not only doesn't help, but it's actually not even considered dead yet. until the limbs actually stop moving. The nerve system also dies down. So we know that in certain countries, even today, they've outlawed shchita, because even after the sheichet shechts the animal can continue to jump around. But our understanding is that there's no pain endured, because although the limbs are jumping around, the head has already been cut off from the body, so it doesn't feel any. There's no brain to feel any pain. Without a brain, there's no pain. No brain, no pain. So that's why we believe that the shchita process is actually the least hurtful process to the animal, because even though the animal continues to jump around, it doesn't feel any pain, as opposed to if an animal is shot and it drops to the ground instantly, that doesn't mean it's not enduring pain, because the brain still is connected to the body. And so although it's completely paralyzed, that does not mean that the brain does not feel pain from the body. So that's why we believe that, obviously we do it because that's what God told us, but we believe that shechting is actually the least painful process for the animal. So when it comes to a kosher animal, we say the moment the animal is shechted, even though the animal continues to jump around, it's already considered dead. When it comes to a non-kosher animal, since shechting is of no consequence, shechting is only used for kosher animals. So as long as the animal continues to jump around, as long as the limbs continue to involuntarily move, it is still considered alive, and it doesn't yet impart the impurity of a dead animal. So it does not impart the impurity of a carcass as long as it is still in its death throes, unless its head is cut off. So like if a chicken's head is cut off, the body can still run around. So that would already be considered a source of impurity if it wasn't shechted properly. But if the head is still connected, as long as the animal is still moving, even though it was shechted, it is not yet considered dead if it's a non-kosher animal. Instead, it is considered just as any impure food, meaning not a source of impurity, or any non-kosher food. If it is killed by being stabbed in the throat, or it is in its death throes, as long as it makes convulsive movements, it is not even considered as impure food. So if it wasn't shechted. If it was shechted, so we have three levels. We have as long as the animal is still alive, and then it's not at all, it neither is a source of impurity, nor does it contract impurity. Once the animal has been shechted, so then it's no longer, it already is able to contract impurity of food, but it isn't yet considered dead to impart impurity. But once the animal stops moving altogether, then it's already a source of impurity. That's if it was shechted. If the animal was not shechted, if it was just stabbed, then from the moment it's stabbed, if it's just stabbed, then it's still considered fully alive until it fully dies, meaning that not only wouldn't it be a source of impurity as a dead animal, it also would not contract impurity that food can contract. A limb that is separated from an animal that is making convulsive movements is forbidden to a Noachide, meaning to a non-Jew, as if it was separated from a living animal, as long as that foot is still making involuntary movements because of its nerve system, it's still considered like it's alive, and so therefore a non-Jew would violate one of the 7 Noachide laws, which is not to eat a limb of a living animal. And meat that is separated from it is considered as having been separated from a living animal. Similarly, when a kosher animal is slaughtered in an unacceptable manner, and it is still making convulsive movements, or one of its sides or the majority of one was slit, it is not considered impure at all until it dies. So as long if the shchita didn't go the way it expected, there was a nick in the knife or something went wrong. So even though he was trying to shecht the animal, he was trying to slaughter the animal the kosher animal in a kosher way. If he doesn't manage to shecht it correctly, then it is still considered alive until it stops moving. If one divides an animal in half, or one removes its thigh and its inner cavity, it is considered as a carcass, and it imparts impurity when carried or when touched, even though it shows signs of life. Similarly, if it was ripped apart from its back, I don't know if you've ever seen actually a lizard shedding its tail, and the tail continues to move off the lizard.
Yeah.
Quite interesting. Similarly, if it was ripped apart from its back or its backbone was broken, the majority of the meat around it severed, it is considered as a carcass in all contexts. So once these huge things happen to the animal, not that it should happen to any animal, but if it did happen, that even if they continue to move, even if the nerve system is still operating, it is already considered completely dead. When the fetus of an animal dies within its womb, and the shepherd inserts his hand and touches it, whether it is a non-kosher species or a kosher species, I guess equivalent would be a vet, a doctor, the shepherd who touches it is still considered pure, although he touched the fetus which died, until he removes the stillborn animal from the womb. So as long as it's still a part of the larger animal, it's not considered a source of impurity. Meat that is separated from a domestic or wild animal, whether from a kosher species or a non-kosher species, while the animal is still alive. Obviously, this is very cruel and completely forbidden by the Torah. If a person was to cut off a part of an animal that was still alive, so such meat, while the animal is still alive, is considered ritually pure and does not impart impurity as the carcass does. When, however, an entire limb is separated from a living animal, it does impart impurity as a carcass does. This applies to a limb from a living animal itself or from a fetus in its womb. I guess this would also be relevant if an animal needed to be operated on. If an animal needed to be operated, I don't know, its foot needed to be removed or something like that. I don't own an animal, I don't know, but I imagine there are times when an animal needs to be operated and the limb needs to be removed. So if it's a complete limb, then that limb would impart impurity. There's no minimum size to the size of a limb, measured to the size of a limb, even if the size of a barley corn or smaller. If it's a whole limb, it imparts impurity provided it was intact when it came into being with flesh, sinews, and bones. If it was a fully developed limb that had both flesh and sinews and bones on it, even if it's the size of a barley corn, then it is considered, it does impart impurity. It must have enough flesh to regenerate it to return to a state of wholeness. If the limb still did not have enough flesh to return to a state of wholeness, or the bone was lacking, then it is pure because it is so small, doesn't reach any measurement. Or actually, because we said that as long as the limb is taken, as long as flesh is taken off a living animal, it's considered pure, unless it is a whole limb that is completely intact. So back to, if an animal did need to be operated on, if it wasn't a complete limb, then that limb, or not incomplete limb, that flesh or whatever it was that was removed from the animal, would not be a source of impurity. A kidney, the tongue, the lips, and the like, even though there are organs that will not regenerate, are just considered as meat in this context because they do not have bones, and therefore they would not be a source of impurity if they were removed from the animal while the animal was still alive. The flesh or a limb of a domesticated or wild animal that could not regain its vitality and reconnect with the remainder of the body, so it's still connected to the body, but it's already no longer able to regenerate itself. It's like a dead limb that's still attached. Such a limb does not impart impurity as a carcass does, as long as the animal is alive. Instead, they are considered as like other edible substances. If they were made fit to contract impurity, they can contract impurity while touching the animal. So again, they're in this middle zone. They're not yet a source of impurity because they're still connected to the animal, but they're not considered fully live, and therefore they're able to contract impurity as food would. If the animal was shechted, the slaughter causes the flesh of the limb that had been maimed to be considered fit to contract impurity, but they do not impart impurity as a carcass does. So even though the animal was now killed, since it already degenerated before the animal was killed, therefore it's not considered a source of impurity. But the slaughter of the animal does not cause them to be considered as if they were separate. Although when the animal is shechted, the rest of the animal becomes pure, since the rest of the animal is considered to become pure once it's shechted correctly, therefore this is not a source of impurity. For the slaughter of the animal does not cause them to be considered as if they were separated from the animal during its lifetime. It does not. And therefore, they are not a source of impurity. If by contrast the animal died, it wasn't shechted but it died, then the flesh that was hanging loosely from it during its lifetime must be made fit to contract ritual impurity, and a limb that had been hanging loosely imparts impurity as a limb from a living animal and not as a limb from a carcass. So on the one hand, it now would need hechsher, it would need to be prepared to be able to contract impurity. On the other hand, it would be a source of impurity if it was a whole lump, just as if it had been removed from a carcass. What is the difference between a lump from a living animal and a lump from a dead animal? Meat that was cut from a lump separated from a living animal is pure, as we just said. It's not a lump, it's not a source of impurity. While meat cut from a carcass imparts impurity when touched or carried if an olive-sized portion is present. The same measure applies in both instances. So what we're saying over here is that the difference between a lump that came off an animal while it was alive and a lump that came off an animal once it died is whether it is able to impart impurity. But an animal that was a treifa means that the animal was fatally ill, it was sick. As we know, every kosher animal that we eat has had its lungs inspected to check that it was in a healthy state of being. And as I mentioned, if the animal is not able to walk up to the abattoir on its own feet, it's not kosher. In abattoirs, they do bring sick animals on a pickup truck and they bring it to be killed, but a sheikhet would never shaft such an animal because it needs to be healthy. So if the animal was a treifa, it was unhealthy, and it was slaughtered correctly, even though it is forbidden to be eaten, it is considered pure as far as the laws of purity and impurity. Similarly, when a person slaughters an animal and discovers a dead fetus, the slaughter of its mother purifies it from imparting the impurity associated with the carcass. So since it was still within the mother's womb, then the shchita that helped its mother helps it too. If one discovers a fetus that is in its 8th month and is alive, it is considered as treifa, as fatally ill. Even if it is shechted afterwards, after it was deemed a treifa, the slaughter does not prevent it from imparting the impurity associated with the carcass. So here we say, the shchita does not help if it's in its 8th month to prevent it from imparting impurity. The rationale is that there's no concept of ritual slaughter for an animal of this type. Based on this logic, when the offspring of an animal was not kept for 7 full days before it was shafted, the slaughter does not prevent it from imparting the impurity associated with the carcass because such an animal is considered like a non-viable offspring. Since it was shafted in less than 7 days, we don't know if it would have survived. So it goes into a different category. These laws are quite complex. As explained, when a person slaughters an animal and finds a living fetus that has been carried for 9 months, ritual slaughter is not required before it steps on the ground. As long as it hasn't been put on the ground, it doesn't need to be shafted, to be eaten, because the slaughter of its mother causes it to be considered as pure. Nevertheless, if its mother becomes impure before the fetus was removed, the fetus does not contract impurity. So although it's not considered, it doesn't need to be shechted, it's as if it's already been shechted, it's still considered alive as far as imparting impurity. If the slaughter of its mother was not performed successfully, and the mother became considered as a carcass, it still remains pure. So although as far as eating it, it's considered post-shchita, as far as imparting impurity, it's considered, if it's alive, it's alive. The rationale is that a living being does not contract impurity at all. Not the impurity associated with foods, nor the impurity associated with the carcass, even though it is considered as one of the limbs of the mother. If it dies before it steps on the ground, it is pure, because the slaughter of its mother causes it to be deemed pure. So the slaughter of its mother helps it to be not require shchita A, and B, not to impart impurity, but still it's considered like it's alive and therefore cannot contract impurity, which another food would be able to contract. Halacha number 8, when an animal that was a treifa, meaning fatally ill, was shafted, even though its meat is pure according to Torah law, meaning we've said that it doesn't become, it's considered like it's a kosher animal as far as purity is concerned. If meat from a sacrificial animal touches it, then this, like if the Korban Pesach, the Paschal offering, touched it, the sacrificial meat contracts impurity by rabbinic law. This is an added stringency applied with regards to holy foods. So although we've said it's considered pure, the rabbis consider it as impure if it was fatally ill and then shafted, as far as if it comes in contact with an offering, with sacrificial meat. Following laws apply when an animal had difficulty birthing its offspring. If after the fetus stuck out its foot and it was cut off, the mother was then shechted, the limb that was cut off is considered as if it was from a carcass, because it was pre-shchita. But the remainder of the meat of the fetus is pure because it's post-shchita. It has to do with when it left the mother. If the mother was shechted and then the limb was cut off, the limb is considered as the meat of a treifa animal that was slaughtered because the mother was fatally ill. The remainder of the meat of the fetus is considered as meat that touched the treifa animal because it touched the part that was cut off, which imparts impurity to consecrated foods but not to teruma. If the fetus stuck out its foot between the shchita of one side and the next, so that in order for an animal to be shechted, two sides to be cut and only one of the two are cut, then the slitting of the second side is joined to the slitting of the first. Although it was cut off mid-process, it's considered like it was after the process to purify the limb from imparting impurity as a carcass does. Okay, new scenario. If a non-Jew shechted an animal, so although the shchita looks like it was perfect, we know that the Torah says that the shchita has to be done by a Jew. If it was done by a non-Jew, then it is considered as a carcass and imparts impurity when carried. It's as if it had been shot for the same price. Shchita only works when it's done by a Jew, and therefore it will impart impurity. This applies even when a Jew is supervising him, and even if he slaughtered it properly with an acceptable knife. Whether the slaughterer is a Gentile, a Samaritan, or a resident alien, his slaughter, which is somebody who keeps all of the 7 Noahide laws and follows whatever the Torah requires of a non-Jew, still, after all, he's not Jewish, and his slaughter causes the animal to be considered as a carcass. It does not deem it pure. According to my estimation, says the Rambam, meaning that he actually hasn't seen a clear indication one way or the other of the earlier sources, this is also a rabbinic decree. For the impurity imparted by false deities and objects offered to them is a rabbinic decree, as will be explained. That it's because of their worship of false deities that the Samaritans were distanced and their slaughter forbidden. I guess he's talking about Samaritans who actually may have had Jewish lineage, but they were separated because of their idolatry. If you will ask, according to scriptural law, it is forbidden to partake of an animal which they slaughtered. So you'd say, therefore, it must be a scriptural law, not rabbinic. He says, no. It can be said that not everything that is forbidden to be eaten imparts impurity. For an animal that is treifa, which was shechted correctly, is forbidden to be eaten, but it's still pure, if the only thing was that it was fatally ill. It is impossible to obligate a person for kares for such impurity for entering the temple, for partaking of the sacrificial foods. So practically speaking, if a person did become impure from this, the Rambam is saying it must be rabbinic, and therefore he wouldn't be liable for kares if he entered into the temple or partook of the Paschal offering or any offering after becoming impure from this animal that was shechted by a non-Jew. And this one can clearly prove his assertion that he contracted impurity. Okay, next scenario. When a person touches or carries the thigh bone of a dead animal, he is pure. The rationale is that any portion of an animal's carcass that does not impart impurity when touched does not impart impurity when carried. So the idea is that the bone was completely sealed. There was no marrow and there was no bone. If, however, it was perforated to the slightest degree, when he touches it or carries it, does contract impurity from the flesh or the meat from the marrow that's within the bone. When does the above apply? When the marrow in it rattles, meaning it's loose. For in that state, it would not regenerate flesh were the animal to be alive. If, however, it is in a natural place and it has sufficient marrow, that it would be able to regenerate flesh on the outside of the bone had it remained alive, then it does impart impurity when touched or carried like other limbs, even though it is still sealed. The bone has not been perforated. We have already explained that a thigh bone is closed on all sides, and that's what we're speaking about. Finally, halacha number 12, when a person thought of perforating a thigh bone but had not done so as of yet, so he intended on it but didn't yet do it, when it touches, it contracts impurity of a doubtful status. For this unresolved question whether the fact that he has not perforated the bone as of yet is considered as have not carrying out a significant deed, or the fact that he intended on doing so already was significant. So generally we say when it comes to Jewish law that it's all about the action and it's not about the thought, but there are a number of scenarios where we say that the thought actually has significance. So this doubtfully does have significance. The fact that he intended to perforate the bone may already be able to cause it to impart impurity, and therefore he would possibly be impure.
Rabbi,
yes.
Rabbi, before we start the test, just something that I'm confused about. In some of the earlier halachas today, and in many halachas, many chapters previously, it was always said that it is forbidden to remove a limb from a live animal. And yet we're talking in today's chapter, quite a few instances were given of removal of limbs of a live animal.
This is a great question. I think it's a very good question. It's very important to remember when learning Rambam that the Rambam deals with whatever area subject he's dealing with at a time. And so here he's not talking about whether one is or isn't allowed to. We know that it is an absolute prohibition to take a limb off a living animal. That's one of the things that even non-Jews are forbidden, one of the 7 Noachide laws. So in that context, the Rambam would tell us, this is an act that is completely prohibited. Here the Rambam is not at all talking about the status of the action. Here the Rambam is talking about the animal. Does it impart impurity or does it not impart impurity? Does it contract impurity or does it not? What was. If the person who did that will bear the consequences. He has caused damage. He has done wrong. But now we're on to the next step. What about the animal? So the person, that's a separate discussion. Now, does the animal contract impurity? And that becomes a new discussion. It's very important to remember this whenever learning Rambam, because otherwise one could sometimes think that the Rambam is condoning certain behavior, but certainly not. He's speaking right now is just in the context of purity and impurity. And therefore he's saying...
Of the animals,
Of the animal, not of the person, exactly.
Not of the person,
Correct.